you don't see that the language has gone through a cycle. Unless if traces have been left, and you will see examples of that. Okay, just the terminology of Meusen with a slot filler model where you use initial and pre-initial according to the position in the verb is very useful. Otherwise, it gets messy, right? Because you can get complicated situations like this one in Yao, the reads which they did not want. So you have twice agreement with read, once as an object marker and once as the pre-initial relative marker, and then also you have a subject in it. And so if you would use the paradigms of agreement markers, verbal prefix versus pronominal prefix, in this case it would work, but if you would only use subject marker versus relativizer, etc., it becomes messy. So I like this terminology of Meusen here of initial and pre-initial. Now here I rely quite heavily on Nsukaku. I will need more time.
Yes.
I rely very heavily on Sukankutzi's work, which I really find excellent, the relative clauses in Bantu. So Meinhof already noticed that the initial of relative verbs can be occupied by a so-called verbal prefix or a pronominal prefix in relative verb forms. And Nsukankutzi pays lots of attention to it, but after him it seems to have been strangely forgotten, which has created problems in the literature, in the later literature. Anyway, the two are hard to distinguish, as you know. So Nsukankutzi used a number of criteria or diagnostics to try and tease them apart. He says, well, there is a presence of an augment. If there is an augment, then whatever follows must be a pronominal prefix, because an augment cannot, a verbal prefix cannot be preceded by an augment because it's a verbal element. It's a bit circular, and I don't think it's a valid criterion, but anyway, that's one of the things he used. Then obviously the shape, the segmental shape of the class 1 prefix, the tone difference between the prefixes of class 1 and 9, between the pronominal prefixes and the verbal prefixes, and then most importantly, or most obviously, the absence of first and second person forms in the paradigm of pronominal prefixes, which is a paradigm of markers of adnominal agreement. So from Meusen's reconstruction, you see that the two series are very close formally. Only in class 1 and class 9 you have some differences usually. In class 9 it's only a tonal difference. Sometimes class 4 is also a tonal difference. And then in class 1 you have a tonal and a segmental difference. So that's what Nsuka used. Just one example, she pursued him with haste in a Zone C language, Mabale. So there you see that the verbal prefix is an A with a low tone. The person who died, here you have an O instead of an A with a low tone, a pronominal prefix, and it's the same one that you find on demonstratives, for instance. So it's a marker of adnominal agreement, of agreement within the noun phrase. Then the augment, and this is one of the languages that Nsuka cited. These things, you have an augment E here in class 8, and the things we saw, and here the source gives a different analysis as Nsuka. Nsuka analyzes the phi here as a pre-initial pronominal prefix, the tu as the initial, agreeing with the subject, and the E as an augment. Whereas Doak in the original source uses a separative orthography and analyzes Iphi as a relativizer of demonstrative origin. And most of the time, the distinction is not clear. It's ambiguous. What is right? I don't know what is right here. So Nsuka says, well, since this phi is preceded by an augment, it must be a pronominal prefix. And in this case, that makes sense. And then you have a whole lot of languages scattered throughout the Bantu area where if you have a pronominalized noun phrase of a first or second person, then you have a class marker in the verbal form. And in Miene, the default class marker in this kind of cases, when there is enforced agreement within a noun phrase, is class 9. So I who read, or you singular who can read, or we or you plural, whatever. The agreement marker is always one of class 9, which shows that this is a pronominal prefix, not a verbal one, because there we would have the first and second person prefixes. Very often it's semantic agreement. You would have class 2 with plural controllers and class 1 with singular controllers. But sometimes also, like in Kagulu, you have well, a form that is dedicated to this task, and in this case, I don't know where this go comes from. But here you have double agreement. I forgot why I put this in. Never mind. Oh, no, sorry. Here you have double agreement. Here you have double agreement, and strangely, in Yao, this is the class 2 marker in relative verb forms, this U, and so you have a pronominal prefix followed by a verbal prefix. So one which is a class prefix and the other a person prefix. Okay. Now, when I looked at, one of the things that Nsuka didn't do is he looked at every parameter of variation very carefully, but he never compared them. And so he missed a number of generalizations. And one generalization that you can find if you look at his conclusions is that if the relative verb agrees with its subject in non-subject relatives, its initial is always occupied by a verbal prefix. Right? And the inverse implicational universal also holds, but it's more a tendency, it's a very strong tendency. If the verb agrees with its relativized noun, then the initial position is usually occupied by a pronominal prefix. And that is what led me to the brass cycle, what showed me that this cycle must have taken place. Right. Okay, stage 1. This is an example of a construction that is in stage 1. The week that is coming, you have a relativizer of demonstrative origin that agrees, obviously, with the relativized noun phrase, and you have a subject prefix that also agrees with its subject. In this case, that's the same referent, of course, but it's two different syntactic relations. So subject relatives don't differ from non-subject relatives from this point of view. They also can have agreement with a relativized NP versus agreement with the subject. Although it's harder to see in that case. Then Haya. Right. Okay, Haya is a language that also has a construction for non-subject relatives with a relativizer, so in stage 1. So here the lexical subject is in pre-verbal position. And so this situation potentially gives rise to languages where you have a stage 1 construction whenever the subject is a lexical subject, because there the relativizer remains in front of the subject, versus a stage 2 or stage 3 construction when the subject is pronominal, because there the relativizer can be integrated into the verb. And according to Nsuka, but I haven't been able to confirm it yet, you find this in Bubi and Kimbundu. And that is a nice thing about this brass cycle. Everything that is predicted is also attested in the Bantu languages, even the weirdest things. Right, here you have an example of Nzadi where the relativizer that is introduced is a non-agreeing form. This can also happen, of course. Yes. Okay, I think I will come back to this later. So, a little side path of the brass cycle. Usually it's assumed in the literature on grammaticalization that relativizers develop from demonstratives, pronominal demonstratives. But there is lots of evidence in Bantu languages that sometimes they develop from adnominal demonstratives. In some languages you see that the relativizer can be, with respect to the relativized noun, in post-nominal or in pre-nominal position. And this can lead in languages like Eton, if they are obligatorily in pre-nominal position, to construct forms of nouns, where demonstrative becomes a kind of prefix that marks the fact that the noun will be modified by a relative clause. So that's a little bit of a side path of the brass cycle, but also attested. Another side remark, I think the brass cycle is an instantiation of the Amai cycle, the adnominal modifier apposition integration cycle, which in the Bantu languages is responsible for many things such as strange prosodic breaks within the noun phrase, or the strange word orders that you find in the word order patterns that you find in the noun phrase, namely that adnominal modifiers tend to be nominalized and then put at the back in apposition, often for focus reasons, and then reintegrated. And I think that this is also sometimes the source of an augment in front of relative clauses that already functioned as relative clauses that had already had a relativizer in the past, are then subsequently nominalized by means of an augment, extraposed and then reintegrated in the noun phrase. But this is also a side issue. Okay. Then stage 2. The relativizer gets integrated into the verb, and I think I put a Luganda example here because in Luganda what happened is that relativizers seem to have jumped over lexical subjects and then got integrated into the verb. And the reason for that is that relative clauses with lexical subject are relatively rare with respect to relative clauses with a first or second person subject or a pronominal subject, so that even in languages where lexical subjects precede the relative verb, the relativizer would still be adjacent to the verb in most circumstances, in most cases, and be reanalyzed as part of it. That's how a relativizer can jump over a subject in such languages. You find that in the Great Lakes languages a lot. Alright, so the cycle also predicts that you can find stacked forms with respect to the cycle, that you have a cycle that has been reinitiated after a construction has gone through the cycle already. And for instance, in Zamba, you can find this, for instance, the duck that Poso gave the guests today. So Zamba is, in this construction, both in stage 2 and in stage 3, because the initial is already a pronominal prefix that agrees with a relativized noun phrase, and it's preceded by a pre-initial that again agrees with the relativized noun phrase. So it's both in stage 2 and stage 3, this construction. I'm sorry, this may go a bit fast, but I only got 45 minutes for these huge subjects. Okay, stage 2. There are many signals of there are many examples of constructions that are going from stage 1 to stage 2, where you have progressive integration of the relativizer. And for instance, you have examples like Swazi, where haplology facilitates the integration of the relativizer into the relative verb, where in subject relatives you would have a relativizer of which the second part is a pronominal prefix, which in most cases is segmentally identical with the verbal prefix. And so you would have the choice between saying Siluane le si si bonaco, or dropping one of the C's and having a stronger integration of the relativizer into the verb already. In this case, a non-agreeing element that is being added in the front of the verb. And we have similar examples in Tsonga. Yeah, this is what I just told. I forgot that the example would come up. So that's another sign of progressing integration of the relativizer into the relative verb. If you see that the relativizer jumps over a lexical subject, I think this is due to frequency, because in most cases you don't have a lexical subject anyway. You have a first or second person pronoun or a third person pronoun. So in all those cases, the relativizer is gradually being reinterpreted as being part of the relative verb. And so then when a lexical subject appears, it's put in front of the relative verb with this guy already partly integrated into the relative verb. Yes. Okay, then stage 3. Stage 3 was the trickiest to prove or to show that it happens. So there you have a reduction of a succession of two prefixes, pre-initial and then initial, to only one prefix and initial. And I think the initiator of this evolution is the relative prosodic weakness of prefixes. And there is indirect evidence for this, and namely other examples of reduction in the pre-stem domain. And there is direct evidence. And direct evidence can be found in dedicated paradigms of relative agreement prefixes that can be shown to be the result of a merger of two prefixes. Indirect evidence, I think the cycles of erosion and recreation out of auxiliaries of tense and aspect markers in the verbal domain is something that is typically Bantu. That might be related to the relative prosodic weakness of prefixes. The cycle of the augment that we have already discussed, that starts out as a demonstrative and then gradually is eroded. First, probably, if this is right, loses its initial consonant to become just a vowel and then just a tone. I think that's another example of successions of prefixes that are being reduced. The loss of the augment when there is a locative prefix, the two are said to be incompatible often, and I think this is because the Bantu languages can't have too many prefixes. And then there is this generalization, the northwestern part of the Bantu languages, from a typological point of view then, has the strongest stem initial prominence, which is partly responsible for the prosodic weakness of other parts of the word. And very few have augments in that area. Most languages in that area have lost the locative classes, and they also have the highest proportion of stage 3 constructions. I think those are all related, and those all have to do with the fact that in that part of the Bantu domain, prefixes are prosodically weakest. That's indirect evidence. Then direct evidence, a trivial example, but that has puzzled many people somehow, including Nsuka. Nsuka says, yeah, in Haya and a number of other Great Lakes languages, you have a very funny phenomenon. You have the pronominal prefix in subject relatives in all the classes. He says, yeah, this must be a pronominal prefix because it's preceded by an augment, except in class 1 where you find the verbal prefix. Now, obviously what happened in Haya, in class 1 and class 9, is that the verbal prefix has a vocalic shape, it's A. The pronominal prefix also has a vocalic shape, it's O. And in vowel hiatus resolution in Haya and the surrounding languages, it's the first vowel that goes. So this long A here is the result of a merger of O plus A. And then my favorites are the languages of zone C, which have a rising tone on relative agreement markers. And you see that the segmental shape is that of the pronominal prefix in those languages because it has an O in class 1. This is class 1. And so zone C is part of the zone where a succession of pre-initial, initial always has a low-high tone. And so the rising tone pattern is the result of the merger of the pre-initial plus the initial here. And it's very funny because this morning I realized that, and Suka says that in relative clauses with a pre-initial and an initial, you find the low-high pattern in quite a compact domain, so zones D and then K and M, if I remember well, and zone B. So there is a gap in zone C, and that's because in zone C the succession of pre-initial initial has collapsed, but you still see the tone pattern. Right. Okay, so the brass cycle says that reduction can lead to the loss of either the pre-initial or the initial, and you find examples of both again. So in Magani or Binji, it is the initial that survives. And you can see that the relativizers in this language are demonstratives which have an initial A and then the pronominal prefix. So you have a succession A, pronominal prefix, verbal prefix, and there the pronominal prefix has gone and what remains is an A plus the verbal prefix. So you have a prefix that agrees, that marks agreement with the subject, but that has this initial A as a remnant of the older relativizer. I don't have time anymore to explain the distinction between the Luba type and the Lega type constructions, where this came from, unless if you ask me if there's still time for questions. Okay. So back to Mason, what does it say about Proto-Bantu? Mason reconstructed direct relatives, which for him are, I guess, subject relatives and non-subject relatives with a lexical subject, versus indirect relatives, non-subject relatives with a pronominal subject. And direct relatives for him were in stage 3. If you put them in the brass cycle, they have a pronominal prefix. Indirect relatives are in stage 2. They have the double agreement. Now, his reconstruction of indirect relatives who are in stage 2 are not incompatible with the brass cycle. You could assume that because the point is that throughout the Bantu zone you find languages of all agreement types. So you still find languages where the relative clause, relative verb agrees with its subject. Okay? So if there were stage 2 relative clauses, relative verbs in Proto-Bantu, then we could still assume that a succession of pronominal prefix and verbal prefix was reduced to just verbal prefix in those areas where you find these languages. But that strikes me as unlikely. Now, stage 3 direct relatives, that's not compatible with the brass cycle. Because the brass cycle, once you have gone through it entirely, and you ended up with a pronominal prefix in initial position, okay, a prefix that marks agreement with the relativized NP, there is no way back. You can't have a verbal prefix again, one that marks agreement with the subject. But you do find that situation in very many Bantu languages. So here, Mason's reconstruction must be wrong. I'm convinced. So I guess Proto-Bantu can best be reconstructed either in stage 0, that means no relativizer, or in stage 1 of the brass cycle, where there is already a relativizer. And Tom, this may mean that linkers and pronominal forms were not as easily attracted into the pre-stem domain at the Proto-Bantu stage as today. And so from this point of view, Proto-Bantu might have been more similar to the contemporary analytical northwestern Bantu languages. So I hope you're happy to hear this part of the
Unfortunately, do we make time for questions right now? Or
1 minute.
1 minute.
Yeah, it's
Okay, very good then, because my question would be just 1 minute. Can you go back to example 24? It's just a question of on the data.
Okay.
Okay, cool. To agree with a class 12 head, what kind of agreement is that? Nyankore is very close to Haya. I would be surprised that it doesn't have the same series, so it should be Aka or Ka, not Ku. Do you have the paradigm for these for the other classes?
I was wondering too.
Yes.
the same problem.
So, yeah, I don't know what has gone on here exactly. Taylor's grammar is not the easiest to use. That's where I got it.
Maybe it's a typo.
Sorry?
Maybe it is a typo.
I don't think so, because I found it in several.
It's not a typo. I think there is a process of merging or whatever.
Yes, it
When
might
it's
have
about
merged with the following
the
O
R and the O.
in this case, or well, anyway, it's. There are very many examples of this where a funny prefix turns up in relative clauses. So there are many languages that have an E instead of an A in prefixes in relative verbs. And so this means that in the cycle something must have gone on. So maybe this is a reflex of a demonstrative form that had a stem U, or of, as you suggest, of a substitutive with a stem O. I don't know what has gone on here, but I mean, these things here, they are not reflexes of pronominal prefixes. That's part of the message. They are reflexes of previous relativizers, which have a demonstrative origin or a pronominal origin or whatever, which were morphologically complex and have then been reduced.
Yeah, my point was just that it's Nyankore is very close to Haya, so it's unlikely that it's different, and Nyam also is different.
But you find amazing typological differences.
3 minutes.
Yeah, but if I just may, it reinforces the point. Okay, this is not a reflex of a pronominal prefix. It's a reflex of a relativizer that used to be morphologically complex. Yeah.
Thanks.